I can't say I remember seeing your face before.
You used to work here.
You worked here.
Loss of identity is a central theme in Poppy Playtime. The most obvious example is the experiments, their child identities literally being physically stolen from them. But if you look closer, you'll see that this theme applies to literally every character in the game. Harley Sawyer and Elliot Ludwig, presumably, were also turned into machines, their physical identities stolen from them. Stella Graber is forced to basically brainwash herself into believing everything that is done within Playcare's walls is for the best in order to keep them from killing her.
Of course, these procedures are far from ideal. I cried like a baby when I read them. But I started looking past the here and now. Started looking down the road a bit. And that's when it clicked. What your researchers can do down here will someday help a lot of people out there. Including so many kids.
Rich Levitz progresses from, in Chapter 1, vocally speaking out against how suspicious he thinks Playtime Co.'s activities are.
Don't you think these kids deserve some real sunlight instead of floodlights and painted skies? Hell, we're not even allowed to talk to these kids.
To, in Chapter 4, towing the company line and encouraging others to do the same. Look, I'm not really reaching for this. Many characters in the game outright declare that they've experienced this identity loss. Poppy's VHS tape detailing the horrifying experiments that she goes through and how she feels less alive and less human after every one. The way that Dowie, during his battle sequence, vacillates between apologizing and begging to be reunited with his parents and accusing the player of being a liar. The notes left by Riley in Chapter 4 chronicling her loss of her childhood and herself, things that Playtime Co. stole from her. You can even look at Preston and Jessica's arc in the Chapter 5 ARG. Jessica, in particular, was an orphan who grew up in Playtime Co. and then returned to work there. This is a person whose entire life was ostensibly claimed as Playtime Co. property. You can tell from the way she talks that her thoughts are not really her own. Her surgical attitude, her lack of empathy for the experiments, her dogged need to justify everything that's done within Playtime Co. as if it's somehow benefiting the world. This is programmed thinking. Whoever Jessica could have been has been completely replaced with a personality created for her in order to serve Playtime Co.'s interests above all else. I could keep listing examples for literally the rest of my life, but I'm guessing you get the point by now, so I'm gonna move on. The reason I'm giving so much focus to this stolen identity concept that I'm working with is because it applies to the player character as well. I have a theory as to who the player character is, which I will discuss, but in order to do that, I think it's important to talk about how this identity transformation has affected the player character, how their time within Playtime Co. has affected them. The letter that's shown at the top of Chapter 1 demonstrates that the player is invested enough in their coworkers, or at least in some coworker at Playtime Co., to return to the factory 10 years after the Hour of Joy, just to explore the possibility that someone might be left alive still. Cut content from Chapter 1 states that the player character missed the Hour of Joy because of coincidence. They just didn't show up to work that day. It's not directly stated that the player knew about the experiments, but there are subtle clues in Chapter 2 and 3 that hint that they did. In Chapter 2, Mommy Longlegs says, "You worked here, so you deserve to die."
But you worked here. So if anyone deserves to die alone, it's you.
Granted, I understand that she's crazy and her word must be taken with a grain of salt at most, but I think this detail is still important because Mommy Longlegs worked in the testing facility with the orphans, so presumably she would have only recognized the player character if they worked in the testing facility as well, or in some adjacent department of Playtime Co. that would have caused them to interact with her. I'll return to that later. In Chapter 3, Miss Delight also recognizes the player.
Yes, I remember. You used to work here.
Miss Delight is a character who is ostensibly trapped inside of the schoolhouse. So in order for her to recognize the player, again, they would have had to be someone who would work in the schoolhouse or some adjacent department. Also in Chapter 3, the player has a hallucination of themselves watching an orientation tape, which blames them for the way things are at Playtime Co.
So should you come back tomorrow feeling unhappy for where you are or what you've done, perhaps They won't allow you such time to figure your place in the world you'd left.
During another red smoke hallucination in Chapter 3, the player stumbles across a radio recording that basically blames them for not being there during the Hour of Joy.
Your presence was demanded 10 years ago and you didn't show up. 8/8/1995. You were supposed to be here. Why weren't you here? You missed the event. You missed the meeting. You missed the party. You have no right to be here.
I think it's important to note that the radio recording doesn't blame the player for the experiments or to what was done to the orphans or to the bigger bodies. It just blames them for not being there during the Hour of Joy. I really hope you can hear all these random street noises that are happening right now, the ones that never happen any other time except when I'm filming a video, I swear to God. In Chapter 4, Sawyer also implies that the player came back out of a sense of survivor guilt.
I'm curious. Why come back? It can't be that a vague letter was your only reason. Was there someone you loved here? Someone you'd lost? Was it the pain of not knowing for sure that brought you here? The experiments killed everyone, including whoever you came back for.
This would sort of line up with what I discussed earlier about the player being invested enough to come back just to see if their coworkers were still alive. Also, the player is used by the prototype in Chapter 4 to indirectly bring about the deaths of the toys hiding out at Safe Haven. Side note, since Chapter 4, I've seen a lot of people saying online that the prototype isn't really the villain, and I disagree. It's true that the prototype saved the orphans during the Hour of Joy, but he is also responsible for starving and killing the toys that refused to join him in Catnap. Keep in mind that said toys were also children. They were also orphans that had been experimented on. I don't think that the prototype saved the orphans out of some sense of altruism. I think he saved them in order to further his own goals. I think the same is true of the toys in Safe Haven that he murdered. And I think that if the orphans were to refuse to help him accomplish those goals, that he would waste no time in disposing of them, just like he did the toys at Safe Haven. Anyway, that's not really directly related to the player character's identity, I just wanted to point it out. The point is, the player's time at Playtime Co. has turned them from an innocent factory worker into a guilt-ridden pawn, a person who has been traumatized and is indirectly responsible for many deaths, which isn't really the player's fault, but they were still used as an instrument in destruction. And I think that's a core element to the game's thesis. No matter who you, the player character, are, you are responsible. You are guilty. You are not innocent. Not anymore. You are not who you were before Playtime Co. Sawyer even forces you to confront this directly in Chapter 4.
Survival necessitates choices. It's this little life or yours. It's your mission. The door will open. Or is maintaining the veil of your morality more important? So, you do understand.
Also, I know there's a secret way out of that room, which you don't have to kill the Nightmare Critter, but when I was playing the game, point is, I am not that smart. I am a toy killer, I am part of the problem, and I'm sorry. I'm saying all this to elucidate that the player's experience in Playtime Co. has taken something from them. It's harmed and changed them, made them different than who they used to be. Their identity has been stolen. That said, I want to look at whose identity that might be. So I'll start with the most popular theory about who the player character is. And the most popular one is that the player character is Rich Lovitz. Evidence. Point 1. Rich Lovitz has his own VHS tape in every chapter of Poppy Playtime so far. This is true for very few characters. Stella Graper is another example, if I'm remembering correctly. Some people think it's her. I will circle back to that one later. Throughout Rich's arc in the tapes, it's implied that he was suspicious of the horrors and experiments happening at Playtime Co., but that he didn't know exactly what they were. Point 2. There's no direct evidence of Rich being killed during the Hour of Joy. Lastly, Rich had friends within Playtime Co., which could serve as motivation for him to come back, namely Avery and Stuart, although he was retired, and also the kid, which I will again circle back to later. I'm doing that a lot in this video. I need to have like one of those cork boards with like pictures and like strings and stuff all connected to each other. So here are reasons that I don't necessarily think that the player character is Rich, or at least that it could not be him. So Rich was the head of shipping, presumably for some time when the Hour of Joy took place. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense for Harley Sawyer not to recognize him, as he states that he doesn't in Chapter 4. If Rich was such a high up by the time of the Hour of Joy, then you would think that Sawyer would recognize him even in passing. Point 2, Rich appeared much more complacent with his role in Playtime Co. and also what they were potentially doing by his tape in Chapter 4. So him coming back 10 years after the Hour of Joy to check on potential co-workers would seem like sort of backwards character development for him. Point 3, it's implied that Rich was already sort of an older mentor figure by his tape in Chapter 4. And during the course of the game, the player performs some pretty athletic feats, requiring them to use the grab pack to swing and lift heavy objects and jump and sprint for long periods of time. A lot of stuff that, if the tapes are to be believed, Rich is likely in his 50s or 60s by the time the game takes place, because you would assume that he's probably at least in his 40s or 50s when the Hour of Joy happens. I'm not saying someone in their 50s and 60s like couldn't possibly do the things that are done in Poppy Playtime, but I think it's less likely, and that just sort of counts as like a reason why it might not be Rich. Also, I get as far as the player's athleticism goes that you could sort of just chalk that up to like video game logic or whatever, but you can do that for anything, so yeah. So another theory is that the player character is Claire Harper. Reason one is she was like a Playtime Co. therapist counselor for the orphans, including Mommy Longlegs before she was experimented on and became Mommy Longlegs. This would explain why Mommy Longlegs recognized her, and also probably why Miss Delight recognized her as well. Also would explain why Harley Sawyer wouldn't recognize her, because Claire Harper probably wouldn't have been an important enough employee within the organization for him to have interacted with her. That said, unlike Rich, the game doesn't really have like a weird focus on Claire's story arc throughout all 4 chapters. Like, she doesn't have her own tape or anything like that. And other than being a direct link to Mommy Longlegs and potentially Miss Delight, there's not really a lot of evidence and story that necessarily would make Claire Harper the player character. So I'm kind of just going to move on from that one for now, unless there's something that I'm missing. Like I mentioned earlier, there's also a theory that Stella Graber is the player character. This kind of stems from the fact that she also has a lot of VHS tapes and a lot of story significance, and the game sort of paints her as being very sympathetic toward the orphans in the experiments, and like she's not really super okay with what goes on within Playtime Co. I think that this is less likely because her characterization in the tapes and in the lore doesn't really match up with the subtle characterization that the player is given throughout. Stella seems kind of more like this sensitive and sort of fragile person. Like, she doesn't really seem like the sort of stoic Samus-esque type action hero that the player character seems to be. I'm not saying that character development couldn't happen. It's just the way that Stella's lore is directed at her and at the player, it doesn't really come across to me like they're trying to say that she is the player character. Also, my theory is that she probably was killed during the Hour of Joy for knowingly allowing the experiments to happen even though she knew that they were wrong. So here's my theory, which I didn't really see anyone else talk about online until like a few months ago. So I think that the game's weird focus on Rich Levitz and his inclusion in every single chapter, I think that this happened because he is the character that the player character is focused on. He is the person that the player character came back to save or to check on the status of. I have a few reasons for this. First of all, it seems weird for Rich Levitz to focus on the VHS tapes if he's the player character. He was part of all those conversations. He knows what he said and what people said to him. Like, he knows his own story already. The pontification on his past just doesn't really fit his characterization. Also, like I mentioned before, Sawyer doesn't recognize the player character, and it doesn't really make sense for him not to recognize Rich, considering Rich was a department head, presumably when the Hour of Joy happened, or at least at some point. Also, Rich had a huge reputation before he became the head of shipping for making a lot of noise and causing a lot of problems. He was very vocal about how he thought the experiments were wrong. I find it pretty unlikely that someone who was demoted several times for being so vocal, that Sawyer wouldn't know about them at all. Another thing is nearly every character that appears in one of these like flashback VHS tapes throughout the entire Poppy Playtime universe or whatever, most of them are identified with names in like the closed captions that play along with what the characters are saying. So like, for example, you have a tape about Rich and it says Rich and then like the line that he delivered, and then Stewart and then the line that Stewart delivered back at Rich. Like I said, most characters in these tapes are named specifically in those closed captions, but there's one character that Rich interacts with who isn't. He's only referred to as the kid in the tapes. He's not given an actual name. I mean, unless Kid is his actual name. I guess it could be an actual name, sort of like how like a goat is a kid. Like maybe the kid is the goat. I don't know where I'm going with this. It's weird for the tapes to focus on Rich and all these other characters that he interacts with, and then to randomly not name one. So another thing that I think supports this theory that the kid is the player character is the kid not being mentioned in the tapes fits in with Mob's characterization of the player character. So far, characterization has all been very subtle and it's been in context clues. There hasn't been any direct identification of the player character or really what they're like outside of, again, them being this sort of like Samus-esque action hero type who doesn't say anything and like goes and kicks ass. Like that's basically all there is. Like yes, the kid is given some characterization in the tape that he has with Rich. His interaction with Rich is very much like a sort of young Rich situation. Like he acts the way that Rich acted earlier on, and it's like sort of showing that Rich isn't the only one that realized that things were wrong, and he isn't the only one that struggled with it and like couldn't keep his cool and couldn't keep quiet about it. There's a point between the two tapes in chapter 3 and chapter 4 where in the chapter 3 tape, Rich says like, not everyone is out to get me, and then Stewart is like, not everyone, Rich, not everyone.
I'm just glad to see not everyone in this place has it out for me.
Not everybody, Rich. Not everybody.
And then in chapter 4 in the tape, the kid is like, it's nice to know that not everyone is against me, and Rich is like, not everyone, kid, not everyone.
It's good to know not everyone here is terrible to us.
Not everyone, kid. Not everyone.
It's sort of like a parallel. Also, another unusual thing about the VHS tape in chapter 4 is how much focus it gives to the kid's discomfort with the rumors about the experiments and disappearances and how he doesn't fit in with everyone else because he's so vocally uncomfortable with these things.
Hell, anywhere else I'd have probably liked Rod. But because he said it like that, and with all the rumors, I just don't know if I can take it anymore. And it feels wrong that no one says anything as loud as they should. Which would sort of tie into the theme of survival guilt if the kid is the player character. Also, the kid being unnamed sort of neatly ties back to the theme of a loss of identity. The kid isn't identified in the tape because it's from his perspective, and that's why everyone else in these tapes is identified a lot more clearly. You might be thinking that it doesn't really make sense for Mommy Longlegs or Miss Delight to recognize the kid if he is the player character, but I think that it still does. In chapter 3's tape, where Rich is talking to Stewart, it's implied that Rich has been to Playcare, which means that he could have been seen by Mommy Longlegs and or Miss Delight, and he could have seen them too.
I mean, don't you think these kids deserve some real sunlight instead of floodlights and painted skies?
Presumably, the kid is the same kind of low-level shipping employee that Rich was before Rich was promoted to head of shipping. So it would make sense for the kid to have seen all the same kind of sights that Rich did, including the Playcare orphanage. So if I'm right, and the kid is the player character, here's some of the implications of that. By chapter 4, it seems like Rich has sort of, like I mentioned before, become complacent with whatever he thinks is happening in Playtime Co. He's learned to sort of toe the line and view Playtime Co.'s activities in a more pragmatic light. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but he doesn't like lose his cool and speak out against Playcare the way that he used to. And furthermore, he encourages the kid not to speak out and be vocally against Playtime Co. on the factory floor either. The implication is that Playtime Co. has subtly sort of taken that vocal advocate quality of Rich and of the kid and sort of taken that piece of their identity away from them. The Chapter 5 ARG elucidated that staff members were responsible for instigating the Hour of Joy. This being the case, it's possible that Rich and or the kid were involved in bringing about the Hour of Joy because maybe they were manipulated into thinking that it would be like more of a liberation event. Hi. If this is true, it would also explain why the player character, why the kid feels guilty for not being there on the day of the Hour of Joy. So that would explain his weird hallucinations in chapter 3. Again, specifically blaming him for not being there, not blaming him for the experiments or anything like that.
Your presence was demanded 10 years ago. You were supposed to be here. Why weren't you here? You missed the event.
This last one is something that I didn't notice myself. It was pointed out by this channel called Glimmer Bites, which I'm always hesitant to shout out channels that use AI in their video creation, but it is something that he noticed that I didn't, so I'll give mention to it. So presumably the kid is around probably 16 to like 20, 21-ish during the events of the tapes that he's in. And 10 years after the Hour of Joy, he would probably be around his mid-20s to early 30s. My memory card ran out of memory. Like I was saying, the kid's age range being kind of between mid-20s and early 30s explains why he was able to perform all these athletic feats that he's been doing throughout the course of the Poppy Playtime games. Anyway, I want to circle back to that core theme of stolen identity, because I think that's half of the theme that I mentioned before. I guess I kind of buried the lead on that one. Playtime Co. basically stole everything from every character in the game who interacted with it, including their humanity in a lot of cases. At least that was their goal, but they didn't really succeed in it, at least not with everyone. The character Riley that I mentioned earlier had her entire life stolen from her by Playtime Co., including her physical humanity. But in spite of that, she literally guarded a key to the prison with her life so that no one would be able to enter it and experience the horrors there. She refused to eat other creatures. She literally starved herself so that no one else would suffer. Despite Playcare literally taking everything from her, she stayed herself and she stayed human despite having even her human body stolen from her. Kissy Missy risked her life multiple times to save the toys in Safe Haven and Poppy and the player character and others. Doey's personality was unstable due to him actually being 3 kids inside one body, but despite that instability and despite everything that it took from him, his mission and goal in Playtime Co. was to protect the other toys in Safe Haven. And not only to protect them, but to care for them and be sort of like a mentor, big brother figure. The player, presumably the kid, came back to Playtime Co. 10 years after the Hour of Joy to try and help whoever might still be alive there. Each of these characters were people who had lives and identities that were stolen by Playtime Co., but each of them chose to reclaim their character and their identity. They chose to reclaim what Playtime Co. stole from them. Poppy Playtime is a horror game. Obviously, it's a horror story about identities and humanity being stolen from people, often physically. But it's also a story about people who fight that, people who fight to retain their humanity and who they are and the good things about them, even when the evil tries to take those things away. Among all of the horrible darkness and evil that happens in this story, there are glimmers of good that shine through, glimmers of people choosing to give life even though they've had so much taken away from them. Stories like this are important now, maybe more than ever, because if a broken and abused toy can still show such great humanity, maybe so can we.